Welcome to the Idaho Main Street Podcast, where we talk about the issues that matter to you. Welcome to the Idaho Main Street Podcast. We're here with Emma Addams from MWEG, also known as Mormon Women for Ethical Government. Did I do that right?
It's a mouthful.
That is a mouthful.
Way to go.
Yes. Okay. Emma, this is great. Thanks so much for getting on.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Okay, so most people in our audience probably aren't familiar with Mormon Women for Ethical Government. We need to kind of start from the beginning. Talk to us a little bit about your organization, what your goals and mission are.
So I think the first and most important thing to understand is that we are grassroots.
Okay.
A lot of organizations claim to be grassroots.
Yeah.
Well, we're grassroots because I'm tired a lot. And I have a lot of people members. And so that is actually one indication that we have a lot going on. We have a lot of grassroots. We've been grassroots from the very beginning. We started as a Facebook group, a group of women, friends, who were across the political spectrum. Some were Republicans, some were Democrats, some were independents. In 2016, they were chatting with each other, and they said, you know what, we need to take this to another place. Let's start a Facebook group where we talk about politics. And let's just, we talk about polarization. We talk about the fact that our neighbors and friends seem to be a little bit extra angry with each other these days about politics. What can we do about it? They started a Facebook group. They didn't tell each other not to invite their friends. Within a week, there were 1,000 women. Within 4 weeks, there were 4,000 women.
Wow.
All organic.
So it started with a few, ended up with a lot. Wow.
So the story of our work since then has been creating an organization to support this lively, diverse, ideologically diverse group of women who are bound by our common faith. We all have either some sort of connection to it or a friend with a connection to it, but are not necessarily bound by political ideology. So it's an undertaking that is beautiful and big, and I think has really been successful because of the fact that we have been committed from the beginning to this notion of peacemaking. That has been the foundation of all that we do.
And there's so much of that we're going to want to get into, but we have to reiterate this fact, because I think people listening, the first thing that's going to come to mind is, okay, what box do they fit in then?
Yes.
Okay, so you're a grassroots organization, so where do you fall? But you've made it very clear, ideologically across the spectrum.
We are. Now, I have to say that if you were to ask our women to self-identify, they're going to more identify towards that middle.
Sure.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of that being that if you're creating a space that's cross-ideological, by its nature, you're asking people to be able to communicate with one another, which means that those on the more extremes, they don't like that. They tend to kind of show up for a while and they're like, this is making me really uncomfortable. Sure. And so I would say we do have those, but it's definitely a more kind of center left to center right in terms of self-identification.
Okay. So we can talk at kind of the macro level and then get down. But so first off, peacemaking. Yes. Why?
Well, I think if you think about a Facebook discussion group and how kind of the Wild West it can be, and you have all of a sudden you have 4,000 women with strong political opinions, very different from each other in one space. The very first thing that our founders did was put in some kind of guidelines and rules about how we treat one another and how we converse. And those have grown into what we call our principles of peacemaking. And because we have this common faith language, those are grounded in language of faith. So there are ones about just the fact that we value it as a principle that is important to us. We talk about the fact that peacemaking demands great tolerance for humans, but none for injustice. So peacemaking doesn't mean that you just say, oh, that's okay. The thing that you're doing is a really bad thing, but it's okay. It means you actually do the hard work of actually, thinking about policy and political outcomes in a way that doesn't allow for things that are hurtful, but doesn't demonize or dehumanize the people that are making decisions. So it treats everyone with the respect that they deserve at every level.
Not appeasement, right?
Not appeasement.
So it's not, letting people just get away with what they want. Boundaries are probably important here.
It's not just being nice.
Right.
That's a common misconception we get. And I think sometimes people come to MWEG or they see our work and they see it's a bunch of Mormon women and they think they're just all being nice to each other.
Friendly.
It's robust.
Okay.
It's actually actual disagreement. I don't understand. Regularly, even within my own leadership team, people have experiences and they have opinions that I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense to me. But in order to understand it better, you do the hard work of being curious. Let's figure out why they feel that way,
sure.
Right? That's peacemaking.
What about those who say, okay, these are adult women. Can't you just let them communicate like they should? Why set up a space where you need to set boundaries? Why not just let them figure it out? Because all is fair in love, war, and politics.
Have you ever been in a Facebook group with thousands of people across ideological ideas?
Nothing
It pretty
gets done.
quickly becomes a very not fun place to be for
Right.
anyone, because what happens is the loudest voices dominate.
There we go.
That's what happens. The ones who have the strongest political opinions oftentimes take over, and then it just negates or kind of removes that space for all of those that are sometimes more thoughtful. I would agree. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones that are thinking about things, they're contemplating, they're listening to other people, and they oftentimes have really good ideas, and they just get drowned out in places where it's set up for the loudest voices to always win the argument.
I think that's really well said. And I think that it's not just Facebook groups. Obviously, it's kind of any time we get commentary on news or current events,
Yes.
it's a race to the bottom. And like, what's the most salacious and evocative and crazy thing I can say that I know will get picked up and promoted?
Yeah.
And then you're right. These thoughtful voices don't end up getting picked up and don't get propagated.
Well, and a lot of the work that we've done to put a whole operations in place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, initially we were this Facebook group, but let's
Right.
move on from that, because
Okay.
that is now like this teeny part of who we are. That is just one area that we have. We have an app. We have a whole like member area. We have multiple spaces. We have in-person events. Like once you kind of move on from a space where I would argue that Facebook and social media are in some ways designed to kind of set you up to have that sort of frustration and anger. Once you sort of like change the venue, it actually changes the conversation quite a bit. And so we've moved so far beyond that to the point where we have chapters in states, and we have in-person events, and we have Zoom events, and we have lots of places to kind of to have these sorts of not just discussions, but make decisions about what do we work on, because we're not just about talking about things, we're going and doing things together.
Love that. Okay, so we've moved on from we started as this tiny little feel-good grassroots Facebook group of people that came together for a space to talk. And then you've mentioned all the infrastructure and everything going on. For those that still may not be catching it, are there other organizations, maybe not in mission like yours, but infrastructure like yours, that they could look to as somewhat comparable?
That's such an interesting question, because I have been searching for groups like ours. I would love to partner with you if you're out there.
Yes.
So I think what makes us unique is that at our foundation, at our core, we are pro-democracy all the way. So everything we do is thinking about our democratic republics, thinking about the Constitution. So even if we're working on immigration or environment or whatever, we're always think about where it intersects with like good government. And so that is unique about who we are. And I think because we do multiple issues, it's a lot, but it also keeps us balanced, because no one issue becomes the thing that kind of takes precedence over every single other one, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think the combination of those two makes us unique, also combined with the fact that we do cross the political spectrum, because it's really hard. It's a coalition. Anyone who's done coalition work knows how hard it is to keep coalitions together. Right? Coalitions it requires a lot of trust, a lot of nurture and care, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of just, honestly, the hard work of doing the peacemaking and the bridge building. You have to be committed to doing that in every day, in every conversation.
Because you're not homogenous, and there's so many wedge issues that would probably drive your members away from each other.
Yes, indeed.
So how do you manage that?
Well, we took a couple wedge issues off the table immediately. So we don't advocate for or even discuss abortion.
Okay.
That was one of the big ones. We found that, again, the loudest voices tended to come in and dominate that conversation. And that's not an issue we're ever going to be advocating for or against.
But not because you don't care about the issue or think it's important, but because putting it on the shelf allows you to be productive in other issues?
That's a really good way to describe it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good way. And we also see that issue as one that oftentimes political actors use very intentionally as a wedge issue, and we don't want to be used. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
And we want our women to learn how to look past some of that messaging that's oftentimes used. And I would argue it's used on both sides of the political spectrum in a way that's really counterproductive. So we're trying to help our members and ourselves become politically savvy, to be the sort of citizens that can kind of see past some of the tricks that are out there, and to really think about, what are they trying to influence me to think or do? Think about power. What are they trying to get me to vote for or do? And then be independent thinkers in that respect, and not fall prey.
Yeah. I've talked to some people recently that maybe you find often happens with your members, where they come and they say, look, I would really like to get informed. I wish I understood these issues, but I wouldn't even know where to start. And they just feel like they disengage because the opportunity cost to become informed is growing by the day.
And we talk about this exact issue all the time because our goal is not to create thousands of women who are like super advocates.
Okay.
Because think about advocacy, it kind of has a negative connotation. You
bit.
think about someone who does advocacy, it takes over their life. Like you kind of don't want to get cornered by them at a party because they're all about their issue and they just go on and on and on. That's not our goal here. Our goal is to take the women that have come to us who are already meaningful, important citizens. They're doing the work of building the civic infrastructure. They are taking meals to their neighbors. They are running the PTO. They're running the neighborhood association. They are connected in all the ways that small d democracy is makes it work well.
Yeah.
And so we're giving them permission and saying what you're doing already is the work of democratic engagement. Now, we're here with a suite of options if you want to kind of add something to that. If there's an issue that you've always cared about and you want to learn how to be more influential on it, we're here to help you do that. And I think going back to your question about it feels overwhelming, everything starts with having access to good information and knowing how to interpret it. So much of our work is based in media literacy. That is like the tool that really from which all kind of that with peacemaking, I would say, are two of the tools from which everything grows.
Okay, media literacy. I'm very excited by this because I remember the old Winston Churchill quote that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. And I think the greatest argument against democracy is also a 5-minute scrolling through most of these Facebook comments, things like that. We had conversations recently with Representative Dixon about, this idea of we're isolating ourselves and the algorithms are feeding us what we want. And so we are eating the type of information that will confirm our bias, right? Walk us through how you help your members avoid what often we are all falling.
Well, it's funny you brought up algorithms because over and over again, someone might have an idea about a way that we could get the algorithm really going on our Instagram account. And over again, we reject it because it's not nuanced. And nuanced political content doesn't feed the algorithm. So we're almost trying to create this little corner of the internet and this corner of America where nuance is queen, right? Where we actually value it and where it's kind of cool. Mm-hmm. It's kind of cool to be nuanced. And it's actually cool to kind of wonder to kind of question our sources all the time. Not in a way that what we try to avoid is cynicism, right, and despair. Because sometimes what we see is that on the opposite end is it's all bad, it's all wrong, the media always lies, I can't trust any of it. Yeah. And that is a message of fear. Yeah. And so we're trying to avoid that. There are concrete, actionable skills that you can learn and practice to help you discern not just between like deep fakes and not, that's one thing, but to recognize bias. And just because a news source is biased doesn't mean you shouldn't read it. As long as you read it through that lens, knowing there's a bias there, and you try to kind of complement that with something else that has a different bias, that's being an informed citizen. And you don't have to spend like 3 hours a day doing it. You really can cultivate a media diet that gives you access to good information. And then don't be shy about sharing that with others. Like our women have become like media literacy ambassadors in their family group, texts, on social media with their friends, where people might share something that's questionable. And instead of going in and saying, where's your source? Fact check. They ask a series of questions that help people reflect on it on their own rather than come in contradicting them or kind of correcting them. Because that's a really important part of media literacy is also not treating others around you as though like they're inferior to you if you feel like you're kind of developing the knowledge to be a more literate person.
So it sounds like the foundation here, maybe step one for media literacy is real intent or honest intent or good intent, and like what you're coming in, whether you're coming in because you need to find something that proves your point or whether you're coming in to prove everything wrong, but it's the right intentions.
I think it would also be hope. You have to have hope that there is good information out there. Yeah. You have to believe that there are sources that are good and that people are good, and that there's a way to access that.
Particularly, there are some journalists that absolutely do fuel the fire, but then there are some that absolutely are providing nuanced but accurate information.
And I think some of the best journalists are the ones who have a more of a obvious self-awareness about their bias. Like there are those out there who are very, like, if someone doesn't pretend to be someone that they're not, I mean, I trust that person. If they're very open about, if they're pretending to be something they're not, that's very different. But I think you can find those journalists, you can find those outlets. And then honestly, the outlets that post like regular like retractions or that like acknowledge errors, that to me is again another sign of trust, right? Because a willingness to show past mistakes, to me that doesn't show like that shows humanity and an ability to kind of show the humility that you need.
And I'd add that elected leaders that also issue retractions, that also recognize mistakes, that also move when we can.
Yes,
that is something that we need to honor as voters and a citizen rather than condemn, because if every political operative is thinking, hey, you made that statement once, it's no longer true, but we got to stick with it, then we end up down like a really bad road.
I mean, who wants to be held? I mean, like as a human, like I am continually going through growth and expansion, right? And that doesn't mean that I'm spineless. It means that I'm open to new ideas. And so I think you're exactly right. We want to see that same thing in our elected officials. And I don't know that the incentive structures are necessarily there for that. But coming back to the citizen empowerment, I think we can look for the good and look for when they are doing that and thank them for that, rather than always be kind of just criticizing all the time.
And most people's faith will be directly tied to this belief in growth and change. But for so often we look at everybody else as like, I don't want change. I don't want growth. What I picked is what I picked, and I want it to stay that way. And that's problematic.
Yeah. No, it is. I agree.
Let's circle back to this idea of nuance, because I think it's so important. And if we brush over it too quickly, we'll miss the fact that there's nuance in the nuance, right?
Yes.
So talk to me more about why nuance when it comes to consuming news or any type of information is so essential for you and your members.
I think that, so we have a responsibility. I'm going to speak now as like the leader of an organization, right? So I've got this group of thousands of women, and my job is to help both the organization be effective. We want to exercise power in a way that influences elected officials and influences the public in a way that is persuasive, right? Sure. And principled and all the good things, rather than coercive. And so in order to do that, you have to have trust. And so you have to make sure that what you're sharing with them is based in good information. So I think that is kind of the responsibility that I feel as a leader. And then I want all my members to be out there kind of mimicking that all over the place, right? I want them to be out when they're reaching out to their legislators. I want them to not be sharing just talking points that just, kind of parrot something they've heard, but I want them to be sharing their real life experiences. I want them to be sharing like how they got to where they got to. And I want them to be listening to their legislators and trying to understand that they might be hearing the exact opposite viewpoint from another constituent. Yeah. And give them the space to like wrestle with that. Like allow them to have some nuanced thinking, and allow them to not just don't treat them just like a conveyor belt. Like your elected officials are just like, you're supposed to call them up, they do what you say, and then we all move on. Yeah. Right? Open a conversation and develop a relationship and treat them like they're the human that they are.
So Congressman Bishop, I had a class from him when I was in college, and he used to talk about nothing he hated more than being bullied by constituents. And he would say, he would balance that with the idea of how essential it was for him to hear and interact with them. But this idea, there's an old quote, I want to say it's from Edmund Burke, but this idea of we elect our leaders, we don't just elect their will, we elect their mind, their intellect, and their judgment. And so when we do interact with our political leaders, we're supposed to give them the best information we can. But we also, if everyone just said, however I tell you to vote is how you have to vote, and you have to vote that way you're out, then how does a politician, how does an elected leader choose between differing constituents?
Well, and I think the weight of leadership is not something to be taken lightly, right? I think it's something that's we need to acknowledge, I think, a bit more. It can be hard in this environment to get a sense of what your constituents think. Sometimes it's the loudest voices. And so constantly we're trying to send women out there to the legislators who are going to be willing to kind of fill that space in between the extremes and, again, open up the conversation. And I think, that's a slower tactic. Like that's not like an overnight tactic. That's not gonna it's the opposite of bullying, right? Yes. You're not, and it's the opposite of shame, right? But it's acknowledging to them, like, we recognize that you're hearing from a diverse group of citizens. Here's why I think my opinion or my perspective or our perspective needs to be heard here. And I think that's if we're doing our job, our women are doing that every day with their legislators.
And we've seen a lot of, we often see sometimes effective lawmakers get beaten primary elections that they don't expect. They come through, and so communicating to lawmakers where you're at might lend them to be more comfortable taking, low profiles, encourage votes that could bring a primary challenge, but in the general, they're okay. Talk to us through how those ideological extremes play a role in your advocacy efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I think we try to, wherever possible, give political cover.
Perfect.
To good behavior, rather than constantly being negative. And it's hard, right? Because it's so much easier to find what people are doing wrong. But I think doing that hard work and doing the follow-up, I mean, we have a whole set of thank you notes that every chapter has, right? Mm-hmm. Making sure they're writing thank you notes to their legislators. Every single meeting I have, we reach out afterwards and try to point out something in the meeting that especially was meaningful, or that, and call that out, call that in, so to speak. So I think there's a little gratitude and graciousness goes a really long way. It really does. If it's offered not with this in the spirit of I'm doing this in order to get you on my side, but in the spirit of fundamentally going back to what we talked about at the beginning, you are a human, yes. I am a human. Democracy, I would argue, is built on the ability for humans to see each other fully and to trust one another and to work together. And there's all this other stuff that goes on about it. There's all the policy and there's all the other, but fundamentally, I'm trying to train the sort of advocates, and we're trying to be collectively the advocates who keep coming back to that over and over again.
And this is the principled advocacy you talk about.
This is the principled advocacy.
Okay, and I kind of lend myself to this idea of we see political operatives who do not use the word principled and who have been...
Sometimes it's a bad word, right?
Very bad word. And they can be, sometimes people separate those two, right? They say if you want to win, you can't be principled. And there are political tactics that can make you an effective political operative, that can help you get policy across the line, that can help you get the people you want elected, people you don't want out of office. Is it tough to look at your approach and sometimes think that maybe it's not as effective as if you would have just dropped the principled and focused more on net gain? Yeah,
but what have you lost at the process, right? A lot of advocacy groups are focused on an outcome, always. They're focused on putting their people kind of at the tip of the spear, so to speak. It's an extractive model. We want to just keep getting a group of people in here. We want to keep sending money. We want to keep sending letters, calls to actions. We are investing in the long-term success of the organization and the women. So I see it actually very much as a strategic move. So it's, again, it's peacemaking sounds, it's nice, it's kind. I mean, all the stuff I'm talking about, seeing people as fully human, that's all really important. I don't have to do this with an eye. I can do this strategically as well. The strategy is a big part of this. We actually see this as the way to do long-term effective politics.
This sounds very similar to what the governor of Utah's Disagree Better initiative was about, and this idea of systematically changing the way we interact so that it doesn't become just short-term transactional fighting, but it can become long-term, long-suffering persuasion.
Yeah, I mean, you can do all that work that you want, with legislators. You can do, I know there was there's this thing called the Building Civic Bridges Act, and there were some people associated with that, and they did a river trip with a Democrat and a Republican, and they were rowing the river together. That's all really good stuff to do. I would argue that unless you're also doing that work with citizens, unless you're also persuading citizens to do that important work, and those who are kind of withdrawing from the political process because it is too messy, unless we can kind of create space and incentives and training for them to get involved, you're always going to kind of be stuck in this yelling match with those who kind of have the temperament and the personality and perhaps the opinions to put their voice forward all the time. Unless you kind of create a community and a permission structure for those whose temperaments maybe aren't quite so loud to get involved, you're still going to get stuck in the same cycles.
So it's this two-pronged approach between not just being able to advocate to elected leaders in an effective way, but ensuring that your members are not just props that you use to get things done. It's about kind of empowering them to follow the same process.
If we're doing our job well, my members are out there doing a million things that I don't even know about. In fact, I'm always hearing these stories and I'm like, I wish I could figure out a way to take credit for that. And we try to whenever possible. But a lot of advocacy groups are about the numbers of letters and the numbers of calls and numbers of dollars. And that's important stuff. And we're doing that. We want to be effective. We want to get legislation done. We're working on multiple pieces of federal bipartisan legislation. We're working at the state level. Like this is not just a feel-good story, right? We really are invested in getting stuff done. But if we're really, really fulfilling our mission and becoming a powerful group, it is our individual members are coming, they're getting the skills, the courage, and the energy in the community, and they are working within their own local communities and states to solve problems. They're bringing the spirit of MWEG and the spirit of what we do to everything that they do, and and no one's giving them, there's no permission needed. They're just doing it because they see a problem and they need to fix it.
So this could be, it could be a philosophical book club on that they get together and you talk about what things and ways to do it. But you've made it very, very clear a few times now, this is about getting stuff done. Yeah. So walk us through what are some of the things, the focuses, the outcomes that you do hope that you can get done.
Well, one of the big pieces of legislation we worked on over the past couple of years was what's called the Electoral Count Act reform. And we successfully took this very wonky, very complicated, lots of words, like some of the sentences were like 20 words, arcane piece of legislation around how electoral votes are counted during the presidential election. And we worked with a totally beautiful bipartisan coalition of legislators and think tanks and advocates and managed to get this passed in, I think it was 2023. So that was an example of what we call our preserving democracy or pro-democracy work. Yeah. It's a lot of times taking stuff that's not super flashy, it's not what they're talking about on the news, and then using kind of analogies that make it meaningful to people for whom maybe it's not an issue of the heart, like maybe clean air is an issue of the heart, or education, or refugees. But I think the important thing to note is that unless democracy is functioning well, all those issues that maybe tug at your heart, those aren't working as well, right? You have to be focusing on like the fundamentals of like government and democracy. So that everything we do is on that. We do work a bit on environmental stewardship, but we try to be at that intersection again of good government and environmental stewardship. So we work with like some regulatory bodies in like Arizona and Nevada in particular, and we work about process, about how decisions are made, and we try to look for those policies where it's both preserving, the environment and helping make the world better for our children and beyond, but it's also doing it in a way that doesn't sacrifice good government.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your reach. So you've mentioned kind of the size.
Yes.
Where are they at in the country?
So we currently have around 7,000 members. We have never recruited. It's been all organic. So we're just this fall doing our first actual membership campaign. It was really important to us that we kind of put the infrastructure in place before we started bringing people in. So they just kind of showed up to us at a really great rate. It's like 5 to 8% growth, which other advocacy groups tell me is like amazing without even trying. So we're up to around 7,000. We're in 49 states. We don't have anyone in South Dakota that we know of yet. It's our spot. We're certainly more concentrated in the Intermountain West, just because Latter-day Saints are more concentrated there. But we have enough of women in different states to have about 13 chapters. And so those are in the Intermountain West, but also like in, I think California, and we have one in, I think, Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., in those areas. So that's our women, that's our membership. And then we have our leadership is spread out over, I think we're up to like 14 states now, and it's pretty like across, the nation. We certainly have more in Utah than outside. Sorry, we have actually more outside of Utah than in, but Utah is our highest number, right? If that makes sense. Yeah. And then our board is also kind of spread around the U.S. So we try, and that actually, that geographical diversity, I think, allows us to be more effective because we don't kind of get stuck in one kind of cultural rut in one place. And
so the infrastructure, do members pay dues that help fund a lot of this? You've got donations coming from people that like your cause?
Well, we were super intentional about building our fundraising because if you know anything about advocacy, it's kind of the Wild West for fundraising. And because we're doing principled advocacy, we had to make sure that we don't have funders that are influencing us from one side or the other. So we've turned down a lot of money. I didn't have a salary for a long period of time. I turned down a lot of money during that time that would have helped with the salary. But we really focused on building our member base first. So it's free to join, but we have about 600 members who also pay as sustaining members just out of the goodness of their hearts. And that provides our funding base, and we can use that money to try new things, to fund new projects. And then once those are off the ground, then we can go find funders. We've already have kind of a fully developed idea. And so there's less kind of influence. Like we don't want any influence from them necessarily. We want advice, we want help, we want introductions. We don't want them telling us what to do.
Right. But when it comes to funding, particularly anything with advocacy and politics, it gets so messy because we're big proponents of the First Amendment right, and we love people's ability to say, I like what you're doing and I want to support it. But a lot of it comes with strings. And we're seeing in particularly these state legislative races, out-of-state money is coming in, and a lot of it, and they're making an impact.
Yeah.
And it's
we
always
don't want a part of
principled.
that. We're like, we've got Mormon, women, and ethical in our name.
Yep.
So we chose a real slow growth funding strategy because we wanted to build it carefully.
So we hear the word lobbyist and we cringe because we think of slimy people sliding money over. But the act of lobbying or going to an elected leader and advocating for your cause is what you do. You go and lobby in the definition of that word. What does that look like? If I'm a legislator in Pennsylvania, how do you approach me?
Well, I usually try to approach, we do our best to, in any situation that we're approaching a legislator, as an organization. So our individuals are doing it on their own all the time. We've kind of trained them how to write letters, how to have conversations. But as an organization, we do try to make sure whenever we go in to advocate for something that we have citizens in that state, right? Because I get a lot of invitations to attend these meetings, and it's all heads of organizations. And then I bring along someone from that state. And it's like, and that person ends up being like the star of the show almost every single time. So in almost any state, like, I can't think if there's any exceptions. I can almost always rustle up a Republican and a Democrat, maybe an independent. So we kind of come in straight up with a very like cross-partisan, look, not just a look, but the reality is. And that makes us more influential. So we try to do that whenever possible. We really do a lot of training around how to have these conversations. We use all these it's one thing to talk about peacemaking, but the actual skills require practice, require restraint, require all these other things that I think unless you have a system that supports it, it can be hard to maintain. So we've kind of trained them ahead of time. This is how we do things at MWEG. We make sure they're well prepared. We make sure all of our information is correct. There's no gotchas. There's no any of that. And we treat everyone in the room as a human, right? And try to interact with them.
So I think, number one, to our listeners, that's actually some really good advice because people don't realize they think they can call up Nancy Pelosi from, rural Idaho and let her have it, and she cares. She doesn't care. Bringing people from the state, elected leaders look at people as votes. They look at them as constituents because they have skin in the game, not just as somebody who can vote for them, but somebody who can donate to them, somebody who can be part of the causes that they're championing, all that stuff. So that's a good reminder that if you have the most impact on the leaders in your own state, in your own community, your own cities. So that's helpful.
Yeah.
The other part of that I think is interesting is this idea of restraint, because some of us are not always good at it, right? Sometimes we think we have to say it all. Walk us through a little bit about why restraint's so important in training your members in their interactions with advocacy.
Well, the blessing of grassroots is also sometimes can be the curse, and that is passion.
Yes.
Right? And nonprofits, and not just grassroots, but any nonprofit. You have kind of this kind of eternal round of passionate advocates. And understandably, we can get a little bit worked up about the issues we care about. I have certain issues that I care about more than others. And so I think the restraint, it comes into making sure that you express from the heart and with your personal experience without using that emotion to try to coerce. Does that make sense? And it can be a fine line. And in our case, too, a lot of our women are going to talk about their faith as being a motivator. But again, not using that faith in a way that weaponizes or dictates that everyone else should come to the same conclusion.
Right. So what are the processes to come to the conclusion? If we're not trying to manipulate each other or elected leaders in any of these spaces of peacemaking, what are the good principles that we can deploy if we want to bring people to the same conclusion we have?
Well, so in our case, we have a very transparent set of, we call them the principles of ethical government. It's like I don't know how many page document with like 3 main principles that ethical government is: the rule of law, the rights of its citizens, and the responsibilities towards one another. And then each of those have like 6 sub-principles.
Okay, give that to us again one more time.
So it's a triangle with the rule of law, rights, so citizen like rights with, and then the responsibility is a huge part of it, because we don't just have rights, we also have responsibilities to one another. So every decision we make about advocacy looks at that triangle and looks at the sub-principles. And this was our way of defining, what do you mean by ethical government? Because philosophers have been trying to have been arguing about ethics for, thousands of years? Like, we think we're going to come along and define ethics. No, we just have to define what ethical government looks like for us so that anyone who joins us knows they can trust us to adhere to those principles. Now, these are just principles. They're not policies. So policy decisions that are made from those principles, I would argue there's a couple of, key things to consider. One is making sure that you're bringing people with different viewpoints and experiences to the table. So when we're discussing what we're going to advocate for, what we're going to take positions on, we make sure that we're getting a broad base, that it's not made by just one or two people. And that's why our leadership team is so big and our volunteer team is so big. It's a lot of people to kind of like to manage, but that's an important part. Like, if there was just 5 of us in a room making decisions, we would make some really good decisions. We'd make a lot of it, I think, not optimal ones. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the next part of it is always taking the time to hear from and consider those who are the most impacted. Okay. Sometimes decisions are made without any input or even consideration of those who are the most impacted, because a lot of times those people aren't necessarily have access to power.
Give us some examples.
So making that an intentional, well, if you're making a decision about something that impacts a refugee, for example, or an immigrant who might not have access to that, that would be an example. Or a lot of times decisions are made about alleviating poverty, and they're made by people maybe who haven't experienced it.
Got it.
Right?
Right.
And so if that needs to be part of the conversation. And then I guess I would argue that policy decisions generally, with exceptions, need to take time. You need to give the time to deliberate, right?
But the news cycle is quick. We got to act before the news cycle goes.
I know. Yes, I recognize that there's some barriers here.
Yeah.
But for us, that's what we consider, and that we kind of would try to model for those around us.
No, and I'm mostly being facetious in that playing this long game and time is so important, but it's not something that those who are trying to make money off of this process would value, right? Those who are trying to get people sped up and moving.
Yeah, and I would argue that a lot of those people who are funding and working on this, they care about these issues. We're all just kind of doing our best here in this really imperfect world. And that's where like my faith really helps me. I try to be just really understanding of people and just say we're all doing our best, right? But there are issues that matter so much that we need to make sure that we don't allow the loudest voices in the room to make all the decisions or to be all the influence. And so a lot of my call is to those Americans and those women in our particular case who have withdrawn or maybe not seen themselves as political or think that that's for someone else, and to actually say, you're actually the voices that we really need. You have ideas, thoughts, opinions, and experiences that are missing. And unless you bring them, then we're not going to get the full picture and make the best decisions.
And that's where we speak truth to power, by bringing them in and letting them see their spot.
Yeah, and empowering them to then, on their own, start to do that, right? Not just waiting for us to give them their marching orders, but truly, helping them become the sort of advocates and the sort of citizens that I would argue we need just more than ever at this moment.
But it all falls apart if somebody's issue or candidate doesn't get across the line and they get discouraged and they say, ethical government's an oxymoron and I'm out of here, right? This doesn't work. I tried to do the good thing, and look at those who don't have principled policies or politics. They beat me. They beat us on this issue. How do you keep your team on both sides of this, both the legislators that you advocate to and your vast array of members, from getting discouraged and walking away?
So I have the advantage of having grown up in a household where my father in particular had just like a deep respect for like the Constitution and the founding fathers. So I was like, from like day one, like knew about the history of the founding of the nation, understood the importance, of constitutional principles, and really saw the arc of history as being one long attempt at this American experiment, and having it undertaken by a bunch of really imperfect people. And so for me, I think taking that long view really, and then honestly going back and reading a lot of the documents in the founding and realizing how much they disagreed with one another, how hostile they were to each other at different times, seemingly hostile, but their acknowledgement up front that everything that they were setting up was a plan to try something that no one else had done. In fact, this week, I was talking to my team about something, and I talked about MWEG, and I think this applies to the American experiment. It is one of the most audacious audacious things ever, right? I mean, imagine that we could all come together in this pluralistic, multiracial, geographically diverse, enormous country and somehow, learn to govern ourselves. And so I think going back to that audacity doesn't actually send me to cynicism, it sends me to hope, because I believe in the vision of what America can and should be. And I don't think that we're not creating anything new here. We're just bringing forth something that has been there since the very beginning.
Yes, well said. And I also appreciate the fact that it seems too often in this day and age that patriotism, love of country, passion towards our story is sometimes synonymous with radicalization and hyper-politicalization. And it doesn't have to be that way. People who have reasonable views can also deeply fall in love with the history of this country. But maybe it's just me, but I feel like the love that, September 12th passion for the United States often gets watered down out of fear that if I look like I love this country too much, then they're going to group me in with those people that are wacko for our country and have these crazy beliefs. And people kind of walk away from that. But I think love of nation is essential for engagement in democracy.
Well, I've had the advantage of having lived all over the country. It's all along I-80, I'm going to be honest. I've only lived at either end of I-80 and then in the middle. So I do have some, limitations here. But having lived in the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest for quite a while, and now the Mountain West, and then having really deep roots in the Mountain West. In fact, my family is like Idaho, like generational, like
Love
back
it.
to dry farm,
Yes.
like totally like, so I think it's Swan Lake, I believe, is the little town, right?
There's nothing in Swan Lake.
I know.
Nothing.
So I lived with my grandfather at the end of his life, and so I heard all the stories about growing up in Swan Lake.
Wow.
So I have this affinity towards it. So I have these different places, and every place I have lived, I have loved the people, and I have seen the goodness. And so it's actually been really hard for me when I hear people talk about those people on this coast, or those people in the flyover states, or those people in the red states or blue states. I'm just like, pause. Like, these are my loved ones. These are my family, my friends. Like, I don't agree with everything they say all the time, but this is my patriotism right here. This is my America, is understanding that they all have a place and they all have a voice, and that we deserve we deserve to do the hard work of making it work together. Like, I think that is, we deserve a country that is formed in those hard moments.
Yes.
And we can do it.
Amen. For those listening that are now getting curious about your organization, what are the stipulations for becoming a member, or where can they go if they just want to sit back as a spectator and learn more about your causes and what you're doing?
So we have a lot of people who follow us on social media for a while before they join, and we absolutely recommend that, because it can kind of give you a sense of who we are. You can see that our message is hopefully consistent, right? And then once you're ready, if you are a woman, you can join us. Most of our members are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We don't have a formal affiliation. That being said, like, one of our core principles is that we'll never advocate against any sort of church doctrine or talk badly about leaders or policy. And so we're not in any way like associated. Does that make sense? We're independent in that respect.
Yeah.
Our mission is like ethical government, and we will stick to that. It's like, it's in our bylaws. So, but we have a lot of people also who aren't members of the church but want to be with us. As long as they're okay with that, they can. And then if you're not a woman, you can follow us. You can donate. We always like that. And there's always, we oftentimes have opportunities for men to attend our events as well. So you can look out for those chances. So it's MWEG.org, MWEG.org. Join there. It's pretty easy. We have an app, which makes you can actually communicate with the organization off of social media, which is this like wonderful thing.
That's big.
It is big. So we've been working for that for years. It finally happened this year.
So there's a space and a platform to engage that doesn't necessarily need to fall in a Facebook comment or an X
it's
platform.
free from the algorithms, which obviously prioritize not nuance. We'll just call it that.
Yes. We have so many things we still need to talk about. Why don't you plug your podcast? You've got a podcast.
Yes, we have a podcast called Proclaim Peace. And our first season is all about reading the Book of Mormon through the lens of a peacemaker. There's been a lot of discussion within church, like within General Conference, within our annual meetings, about being a peacemaker. We have a lot of theology and doctrine about being a peacemaker. So this podcast is looking at the scripture that forms the backbone of our faith through the lens of a peacemaker, and thinking about in new ways, right? But very accessible. It's not like super like academic, like big words and big thoughts. So there's a lot of good stuff happening there. It's very accessible to any of us who want to be, I think in our case, peacemakers and disciples.
And for those not of the faith, would they find it engaging?
We do have multiple guests who are not members of the faith. So you actually don't even have to have read the scriptures to the scriptures that we're referring to get it. We talk about the stories. We had Ibu Patel, who's the CEO of Interfaith America. We've had, and we have more guests coming who are not. So absolutely.
I love the approach here. I love this idea that we've covered in the importance of nuance and digging into it. Everything is not black and white, and sound bites and headlines are not the story. I like this idea of how you've taken an approach to, if we empower and inspire our members on passionate issues and they go forth with principles, then we can really actually do stuff and get stuff done.
And we do get stuff done. We actually do get stuff done. So it's not all just this theory. Yeah. It's working.
Love it. So we're going to keep track. We'd love to have you back on. We'd love to talk more about this stuff. We know how busy you are, so we're going to end it here. But any last word you want to say to our listeners throughout the country?
I would say as we're entering an election season, one of the most freeing ideas that that we've kind of developed over the past couple of years is this idea of being a principled voter. And it has we've had women who have felt kind of locked in ideological or partisan, almost, I would say, jails. And once we introduced them this idea and they started to really look at their ballot and their decisions based on principles, things like, what issues do I care about the most right now? And pro-democracy, to be honest, and peace. It's really allowed them to, I think, become more of themselves. Because I think sometimes parties have an interest. Parties are a necessary part. It's important to have strong parties. I am not we're going to rip on parties person at all. But I think there is danger when our party becomes our entire identity. And I'm someone who I think did that. Not fully, but I was definitely had a party that I had loyalty to for a long period of time. And once I kind of said, this is an important part of me. This maybe aligns with me ideologically, but it's not my full self. It actually helped me just feel better about myself in general. So being a principled voter ends up being a really positive thing for our members. So as you're thinking about the election, as you're thinking about who to vote for, just be open to the idea that there may be people and policies outside of the narrow boxes that you have traditionally voted in.
Yeah, a beautiful way to self-identify. As people try to put you in a box, maybe we all should try to attain the box of principled voter.
There you go.
I can co-sign that.
So
much. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.